Hannah Murray, TRE in the afternoon.
Good afternoon. Joining us on the line now is award-winning journalist and author Pagan Kennedy to talk about the largely forgotten inventor of the rape kit, Marty Goddard. Her book, The Secret History of the Rape Kit, is the story of the troubled, heroic woman who kicked off a feminist revolution in forensics and then vanished into obscurity. Welcome to the show, Pagan.
Hi there. Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Thanks so much for joining us. So how did you come across this story? How did you find out about or hear about Marty Goddard?
So in 2018, rape kits were very much in the news because of the backlogs. There were almost 500,000 kits that had not been processed by the police. And so that had become a big scandal. So I was kind of thinking about rape kits, but it was as if this thing I had always known about, or at least since college, I guess, suddenly I hadn't really thought about it very much. It was just always there in the background. And suddenly it was as if my attention zoomed in on it. And I thought, wow, isn't it amazing that there's this national system where, survivors can go in and submit evidence and have it tested. And then that can be, put into a database. It all seems so amazing, even though, obviously it wasn't functioning exactly perfectly, that there would be something like that kind of in a world where so many things, it seemed to me, were designed to allow sexual assault to happen. So I became curious about how did this come to be? And my first stop was Wikipedia, where at that time it said that the inventor was Louis Vitullo, a police sergeant in Chicago. But after, doing a whole bunch more research, I began to realize that there had been this activist named Marty Goddard who was deeply involved. And because Vitullo was dead, I began hunting for Marty Goddard because I really wanted to hear her story. So that was sort of how the search began for me.
Yeah. So tell us a bit more about her and how and why she came to invent the rape kit.
Well, actually, I would like to clarify that actually neither she nor Vitullo nor anybody who was credited with inventing it actually did invent it. The first one. There were actually a lot of little rape experiments with these forensic kits in the early 70s. They sort of popped up and, didn't really go anywhere, many of them, but people were kind of thinking in that direction. And, but the one that evolved in Chicago was really different. It was much more scientific and much more, it really came from a different point of view, which I can talk about. And that's the one that became the basis for the national system. But I'm sorry, I got off on a tangent. You asked Marty Goddard, her first step into this world happened when she was volunteering at a crisis hotline in the early 70s for what back then they called these kids who lived on the streets runaway teens. It was the hippie generation. And so the idea was these kids were running away to, have fabulous lives or something. But as she took the calls, she heard so many stories from kids who had ended up on the streets because they were fleeing from abuse. And at the time there was, it was thought that child abuse or child sex abuse was very rare. And she became aware that there was this vast hidden epidemic, and her thought kind of went to the perpetrators. What if there's all these victims out there? There must be a lot of perpetrators, and why aren't we aware of them? Why aren't we, we need to make this visible. So that was the beginning of her crusade.
Yeah. And how do you go from, or how did she go from caring about an issue and really thinking that something needs to be done to seriously doing something about it?
Yeah. it was also a time, this 1972 to 1974 was the time when there was a kind of awakening happening around sexual assault. So there were rape crisis centers and things like that being formed. And there was the first generation of women were emerging from law schools. So you had these sort of newly minted lawyers. So there was suddenly this movement, and there was a great deal of pressure being put on the lawmakers in Chicago to do something. And so that's how Marty Goddard, they created a rape kit task force, and Marty Goddard ended up on that. And that gave her the ability to go into hospitals and crime labs and just interview everybody about what the process was then. They had a very sort of ad hoc, not very organized process for collecting evidence after a sexual assault, but mostly they didn't collect evidence or listen to the accusers. There was actually, if you'd opened up a police handbook at that time, you might see, there were instructions that many women who accuse someone of rape are lying. So, if they seem like liars, just don't pay attention to them. And that was very much the attitude. There was a whole attitude that you just simply couldn't prove sexual assault because it would always be a he said, she said. And that was the power of creating an evidence system, because it really was striking a new chord. It was the idea that, yes, actually, you can prove it if you have the will to do so, if you really, collect physical evidence and interview the survivor and, do all the due diligence. Yes, you can get proof. And so this part of why Marty Goddard created, why her system caught on, I think, was because it really came from this point of view that, I like to call it an evidence-based evidence system instead of, some other rape kits said, basically the instructions said, well, if you think if you don't like the accuser, you don't have to listen to her. It's all your judgment call. So you don't really have to collect evidence. You can just sort of prejudge. And of course, that's not how you get good data. That's not how you get good evidence.
And presumably for a rape kit to be effective, it needs to be used pretty much straight away after the alleged crime has been committed. You couldn't say years later that it could be used. Can you just kind of run through what exactly is in a rape kit and how it would work?
And actually, if it's stored correctly, the DNA actually can survive for a very long time, which is why these, when they finally did process many of the kits in the backlog. I mean, many of those now we have the results, and those can be used, even though many of them are quite old, to solve cold cases or shed light on a current crime, So that's one of the things that's kind of amazing about DNA evidence. But what's interesting is that in the 1970s, they didn't yet have DNA forensics. That was invented in the mid 1980s. So it was a very deceptively simple system of just a cardboard box with swabs and envelopes and slides and things, just basic things like that. The most important thing, I think, in the kit was a sheet where anybody who used the kit, the nurses or the crime lab or the police officer, whoever dealt with it, had to sign off on it. So you had to take responsibility. If you contaminated the evidence, it could be traced back to you, if the exam wasn't done right, or something like that. And so much of what Marty Goddard did was outside of the rape kit. She created whole training systems for hospital workers and crime labs and got the kits raised the money, got the kits into hospitals, try to create kind of a system in which everybody's on the same page instead of being not talking to each other, which was the situation before that often.
Yeah, there needed to be a system in place that everybody had to follow when somebody came into a police station or a hospital saying that they'd been raped. There needed to be a procedure that had to be followed, I take it.
Yes, exactly. I mean, she's I think the Marty Goddard story it's really interesting, and I'm really fascinated with the question of how you make change, positive change. And I think her story is such a example of how it's important to really dig into the weeds and figure out not what you think the problem is, but really figure out what problem it is that you need to solve and where the failure points are. Because when she interviewed people in the crime lab, they said, well, these idiots in the hospitals don't, they prepare the slides the wrong way, or they tear up they're trying to help the patient, so they tear up their clothes off. But when they do that, they ruin the evidence. So they just send us this useless evidence and we just throw it out. And of course, that was clear. It became clear, like, well, okay, you need to then have the staff in the hospital are doing their best. It's just they've never been trained and nobody's ever told them what the crime lab needs. So, she was really looking at the places where the system, the kind of very hinky system that did exist, needed to be repaired and fixed, and how to patch up everything so it really worked and was much stronger.
Yeah. I mean, that is key, isn't it? Having systems in place that everybody knows. So every victim or alleged victim that comes in needs to be treated correctly and put through a certain number of questions and the right kind of procedure. So everyone has I know it's not a trial at this stage, but is treated correctly. Yeah.
And, I think a lot, it's very easy to kind of focus on the object of the kit. And it's a fascinating object with a fascinating history. But it was also what she and the other activists of that time did was create a new set of norms, a new set of ideas that you could solve a rape case. And also that every person who accused rape was entitled to be listened to go to a hospital, have this very lengthy forensic exam, to have the evidence collected, have that evidence processed. And then the nurses would also be trained to testify in court, so that they would stand up in their lab coats, or the doctors, in their white coats, or the people from the crime lab, and they would testify, look, this is how we collected the evidence. Here's what we're seeing. And that, at a time where victims really weren't believed or were blamed for what happened to them, it also added just this new element where juries were now more, going to be more likely to believe the accuser.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things which should be really obvious, but sadly hasn't always been obvious, is the huge importance of the bedside manner of the nurse or the doctor who is dealing with the person who has come in, the victim. Because so often with sexual assault, the victim is feeling things like shame and guilt and words associated with them having done something wrong, which they haven't. They're the victim. And how somebody responds to them sharing what has happened to them can be crucial with how they feel about themselves and the attack that happened to them for the rest of their lives. I mean, it's really important how they're treated and how people handle them when they have the courage to share what's happened to them. You know, so many people, we say, oh, why didn't they speak up earlier? Why didn't they come forward? You know, if this happened to you, why didn't you say something at the time? Like, it's the easiest thing in the world. And as we know through history and through so much documentation, it's not an easy thing to come out immediately after it's happened and tell someone that you've been attacked in some way.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, what was also really interesting about Marty Goddard is she came, you know, this whole kind of system, forensic system, was a world created and controlled by men. And there's a really interesting story of how she managed to operate in that world. But everything kind of came from everything had been designed before this for the ease of the police. You know, what would be easy for the police? And she came to it with such sympathy for the accusers or the victims. And she was shocked. I found these amazing oral history interviews with her, and she spoke about how shocked she was just watching what happened after an assault, and how first of all, the police might take the woman to a hospital and yell out, you know, we've got a rape here. Like, so everybody in the emergency room hears it. And then after the forensic exam, the clothes of the victim would be collected as evidence. And so she would be sent home naked, just like in a hospital, Johnny, in a police car.
Oh.
So you're like coming out of a police car, walking back to your house, basically naked in front of your neighbors, you know. So she was like very focused on all the little details of how this unfolded and where can we intervene? How can we change this? And so it was, again, like that, her fascination with the details, and that, you know, which is the heart of also getting good evidence, is being very focused on the small, tiny things that, you know, might be invisible if you're not paying attention.
Yeah. Oh, it's just horrific hearing that. I mean, the idea that, you know, we're supposed to be encouraging women or men to be able to speak out when they've been raped or abused in this way. For them to be treated like that isn't very encouraging, is it? You know, when we hear of these stories, the idea of coming out and being able to talk about it and tell someone what has happened, if that experience is as traumatic or just also traumatic as the assault itself, then it's not encouraging for people to do it. You know, you want to know that if you are going to tell your story, that the person you're telling, whether it's a police officer or a nurse, whether it's a man or a woman, is going to be understanding and sympathetic and, you know, make you feel okay and heard and understood.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why, you know, there was post Marty Goddard, you know, in the 80s, 90s, there was this effort to create standards of care for forensic nursing and create these sane, as they're called, sane nurses who are trained in trauma care, and they're trained to both collect evidence and also really not further traumatize the survivor. And so that was also a really important development, although that's sort of out of the frame of my story, because there was already a lot to say about just developing the kits and the evidence and the evolution of DNA and everything that happened afterwards. And I mean, there's certainly more to tell. You know, there's so much. And it's funny how little attention this all seems to receive. And even now, you know, I would love to know, I think it'd be great to know what really, really works in terms of how do you collect the best evidence, and how do you, like, could we learn more, use new tools that we have? You know, we have all these new digital tools, we have telemedicine, we have all of that. Could we use some of that to improve access or improve the way we get evidence or make the experience better for the survivor. And I don't have any answers there, but I think it's a really important discussion that we need to have. There hasn't been a huge amount of focus on that. I was actually working on the book during the height of the pandemic. And, it was, as I was talking to people, I was learning a lot about the vulnerabilities of just citing this system in hospitals, because obviously if there's a pandemic and all the ERs are shut down or they're super dangerous to go into, people can't report a rape. And so rape reporting went way, way down during that time. So that's something to pay attention to, I think.
Yeah.
And maybe we can learn from some of the things that have gone wrong, but certainly it's with all its flaws and all the things we need to fix, it's still just an amazing system that can, both provide, if you have several kits showing the DNA from the same perpetrator, that tells you a lot about there's a serial perpetrator out there. At the same time, the kits have been used also to exonerate innocent men. And more they're being used. It looks like I found a study showing that the need for exonerations has gone down because the more the rape kits are used, the more you can rule out a suspect before a trial. So the innocent person never even goes to prison in the first place, which is obviously what we really want.
Yeah, of course. Well, it's a fascinating subject, and thank you for coming on and telling us about it. If listeners want to get a copy of The Secret History of the Rape Kit, a true crime story, it's available on our website, tre.radio, and it's by Pagan Kennedy, who we've been chatting with today. Pagan, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much.